The evening air held a crisp bite as Maylene locked up her small apartment and hurried down the steps. Autumn in Chicago meant the sun disappeared earlier each day, and she was already running late for her evening shift. Her worn leather bag bounced against her hip, carrying not just her waitress uniform but also the dog-eared sheet music she'd been practicing during her morning break. At 26, May wasn't where she had planned to be. 6 years ago, she'd walked the prestigious halls of one of the country's top music conservatories, her fingers calloused from hours of practice, her future seemingly mapped out in black and white like the piano keys she loved. But life had other plans. "You're cutting it close," said Rodrigo, the head chef at Le Ciel, as May slipped through the back entrance of the Upscale French restaurant. "Table 7 already asked for you specifically." May nodded, quickly hanging up her coat and pulling her neatly pressed uniform from her bag. "Family emergency," she lied, not wanting to admit she'd lost track of time while playing a particularly challenging piece on her neighbor's piano. Her own had been sold 3 years ago when her mother's medical bill started piling up. The restaurant hummed with quiet conversations and the gentle clink of expensive silverware against fine china. Le Ciel catered to Chicago's elite, business executives, old money families, and the occasional celebrity. May had learned to blend into the background, to anticipate needs before they were voiced, to smile politely at comments about her exotic features. The tips were good, and the hours allowed her to take care of her mother during the day. "There she is," a familiar voice called out as May approached table 7. Mrs. Henderson, a regular who always ordered the same Bordeaux and often slipped May an extra $50 for a young lady with such talented hands. Mrs. Henderson had once caught May playing the baby grand in the restaurant's private dining room during a lunch break. Instead of reporting her, the older woman had sat silently until May finished the Debussy piece, then applauded with tears in her eyes. "I was just telling my friends about you," Mrs. Henderson said, gesturing to the 3 well-dressed couples at the table. "I said Le Ciel has not only the best coq au vin in the city but also employs a hidden virtuoso." May felt her cheeks warm. "You're too kind. The special tonight is a pan-seared halibut with a saffron beurre blanc. Would anyone like to hear about our wine pairings?" She moved through her shift with practiced efficiency, her mind half on her work and half on the piece she'd been struggling with that morning, a Rachmaninoff that required hands bigger than hers. She'd been finding workarounds, adapting the fingering to accommodate her reach. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. During a rare quiet moment, May found herself near the maitre d's desk where Andre was looking more stressed than usual. "Everything okay?" she asked, refreshing the water pitcher she carried. Andre ran a hand through his thinning hair. "The Burn Foundation event next week, they just called. Their pianist canceled some viral infection. 3 months of planning, and now no music for their biggest fundraiser of the year." The Burn Foundation was one of the city's most prestigious arts patrons, hosting an annual gala that raised millions for music education in public schools. Le Ciel had been selected to cater the event this year, a major coup for the restaurant. "Can't they find another pianist?" May asked, something fluttering in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. "Hope, maybe. Or fear on a week's notice? For that crowd?" Andre shook his head. "They need someone who can play background during cocktails, then feature pieces during dinner. 2 hours of classical and jazz standards without repeating. Their usual guy has been with them for a decade." May bit her lip, her fingers twitching slightly against the water pitcher. She could do it. She knew she could. Her repertoire was extensive. She still practiced daily, either on her neighbor's upright or on the piano at the community center, where she volunteered teaching kids on Saturday mornings. But she was just a waitress now. The thought of playing in front of Chicago's wealthiest arts patrons made her stomach clench. What if they laughed? What if her skills had deteriorated more than she realized in the years since she'd performed publicly? "I need to call the kitchen staff for the event," Andre muttered, picking up the phone. "See who can handle extra hours." May walked away, delivering fresh water to her tables and taking dessert orders. As she worked, her mind kept returning to the foundation event. Music education had saved her as a child. The free piano lessons at her elementary school had been her first introduction to a world beyond her family's small apartment. Her teacher had recognized her talent, had helped her apply for scholarships, had opened doors that someone from her background rarely got to walk through, and then she'd had to close those doors herself when her mother got sick. After her shift ended at midnight, May declined Rodrigo's offer to share an Uber. She needed to walk, to clear her head, to make a decision. The night air had grown colder, but she welcomed the chill against her flushed skin. Her apartment was 20 blocks away in a neighborhood that was neither dangerous nor particularly safe. The streets were quiet this time of night, most windows dark except for the occasional blue flicker of late-night television. May walked quickly, her bag now containing leftover bread and a container of soup that Rodrigo had pressed into her hands. For your mother. 3 years ago, when her mother had called complaining of persistent headaches, May had been preparing for her first major recital in New York. She'd flown home immediately expecting to return to school within days. Instead, she'd found herself in hospital waiting rooms, filling out insurance forms and eventually withdrawing from the conservatory. The diagnosis, a benign but problematic brain tumor, had required surgery and a lengthy recovery. Her mother was better now, working part-time at the local library, but May had never gone back to school. "It's just a detour," her piano professor had said when she called to explain. "Your talent doesn't disappear because you press pause." But months had turned into years. Her student loan still needed repayment whether she had a degree or not. And gradually, playing had become something private, a secret joy rather than a future. The stairs to her third-floor apartment creaked as she climbed them. She unlocked the door quietly, not wanting to wake her mother who would be asleep in the small bedroom they shared. The living room doubled as a kitchen with a folding screen creating the illusion of separate spaces. There was no room for a piano here, not even a keyboard. The walls were thin, and neighbors complained. May set down her bag and pulled out her phone, scrolling to the recording she'd made years ago of herself playing at her last school recital. She rarely listened to it. The gap between who she had been and who she was now sometimes felt too painful to acknowledge. But tonight she needed to know. She put in her earbuds and pressed play, closing her eyes as the first notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor filled her ears. Her playing had been confident then, technically precise but also emotional. She could hear where she'd made each artistic choice, where she'd let the music breathe, where she'd pushed forward with urgency. Could she still play like that? More importantly, did she want to? The Byrne Foundation event wasn't a concert hall in New York. It wasn't the future she'd once imagined for herself. But it was something. A chance to play for people who understood music, who supported it, who might. May opened her eyes and stopped the recording. She was being ridiculous. Andre hadn't even asked her to play. He probably didn't know about her background. And even if he did, a high society fundraiser wouldn't want a waitress as their entertainment. She quietly changed into her pajamas and slipped into bed beside her mother, who stirred slightly but didn't wake. Tomorrow would be another day of serving others, of smiling politely, of keeping her dreams tucked away where they couldn't hurt her. But as she drifted toward sleep, her fingers moved against the blanket, playing invisible keys, working through the Rachmaninoff problem that had troubled her that morning. In her mind, she wasn't in a small apartment in Chicago, but on a stage. A spotlight warming her face, the weight of a concert grand responding to her touch. Some dreams don't die easily, even when you try to bury them. May woke to the smell of ginger tea and the soft shuffling of her mother in their small kitchen area. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains, casting a warm glow across their modest apartment. For a moment she lay still, remembering the dream she'd been having. Her fingers gliding across piano keys on a stage bathed in golden light. "You were talking in your sleep," her mother said, bringing a steaming cup to May's bedside. Her mother's accent was still thick despite decades in America. "Something about music." May sat up, accepting the tea with a grateful smile. "Just an old dream." Her mother's face softened. "Not so old. Your hands still play when you think no one is looking," she demonstrated by wiggling her fingers in the air. "At dinner, on the table, even when you fold laundry." It was true. May had never stopped playing, not really. Even without a piano, her mind continued to work through pieces, her fingers practicing invisible scales during quiet moments. "The restaurant is catering a big event for the Byrne Foundation next week," May said carefully, blowing on her tea. "Their pianist canceled." Her mother sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes, so like May's eye, and lighting up with a hope that made May's chest ache. "Did they ask you to play?" "No," May said quickly. "No one there knows about before. I'm just a waitress to them." "You were never just anything," her mother replied, a familiar stubbornness in her voice. "Your music is a gift. Why hide it?" They'd had variations of this conversation many times over the past 3 years. Her mother carried a heavy guilt for May's abandoned education, despite May's insistence that family came first. The truth was more complicated. Yes, she'd left school for her mother, but staying away had been her own choice, fueled by a growing fear that she'd already missed her chance, that the classical music world had already forgotten her. "I have the morning shift today," May said, changing the subject, "and you have physical therapy at 2. Don't forget." Her mother sighed but didn't push further. She understood the conversation was over, for now. Le Ciel was quiet in the morning, with only a few tables occupied by business people having breakfast meetings. May moved efficiently between tables, refilling coffee cups and delivering delicate pastries. Her mind, however, kept drifting to the Byrne Foundation event. Would playing one night really change anything? Could she even still perform at that level after so long? "Earth to May," Rodrigo said, waving a hand in front of her face. "You've been staring at that coffee pot for 5 minutes." May blinked, realizing she'd been lost in thought. "Sorry, didn't sleep well." "Well, wake up. Andre wants to see all staff about the foundation event next week." "Meeting in 10 minutes, May's heart jumped. She set down the coffee pot and straightened her uniform, suddenly nervous though she wasn't sure why. The staff gathered in the private dining room, where Andre stood looking unusually formal in a pressed suit, rather than his normal attire. Next to him was a tall woman with silver hair cut in a sharp bob, dressed in clothes that screamed money but in a quiet, tasteful way. "Everyone, this is Mrs. Byrne of the Byrne Foundation," Andre said. "As you know, we're catering their annual fundraiser next week at the Grand Hotel. Mrs. Byrne has come to discuss some last-minute changes." The woman stepped forward, her gaze sweeping across the assembled staff. "Thank you all for accommodating us. As some of you may have heard, our pianist has fallen ill and won't be able to perform. Music is central to our event. We raise funds for music education in schools." After all, May felt Rodrigo's eyes on her, but she kept her gaze firmly on Mrs. Byrne. "We've been calling around, but everyone suitable is already booked," Mrs. Byrne continued. "We need someone who can play cocktail hour standards and then more complex pieces during dinner. 2 hours minimum, classical and jazz repertoire. Perhaps we could help," Andre said smoothly. "What about recorded music? We have an excellent sound system we could bring." Mrs. Byrne's mouth tightened slightly. "Our donors expect live music. Many are musicians themselves or sit on symphony boards. Recorded music would be inappropriate." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. May felt her pulse quickening, her palms growing damp. She could do it. She knew she could. But the thought of putting herself forward, of claiming abilities she hadn't used professionally in years, made her throat close up. "Actually," Rodrigo said suddenly, "we might have someone." All eyes turned to him, and May felt a rush of panic as his gaze landed directly on her. "May plays piano. I've heard her at the community center where she teaches kids on weekends. She's incredible." May wanted to disappear through the floor. Andre looked surprised, then interested. Mrs. Byrne's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. "You play?" Andre asked. May's mouth was dry. "I used to." More seriously, "She's being modest," Rodrigo continued, ignoring May's warning glance. "She studied at the conservatory. I looked her up online once. There are videos of her recitals from a few years back. She's not just good, she's exceptional." Mrs. Byrne was studying May now with new interest. "Which conservatory?" "Eastman," May said quietly. "But I didn't finish. I had to leave during my 3rd year." "Family emergency." Recognition flickered in Mrs. Byrne's eyes. "May Lin, the one who won the Young Artist competition in 2019? May nodded, surprised the woman would know of a competition from 6 years ago. "I was on the board," Mrs. Byrne explained. "Your list was extraordinary. We all wondered what happened to you." The room had grown uncomfortably quiet. May could feel everyone staring, seeing her differently now. No longer just the efficient, quiet waitress, but someone with a past, with talent, with a story they hadn't known. "Life happened," May said simply. Mrs. Byrne nodded, something like understanding crossing her face. "Would you consider playing for our event? We would pay you, of course, the same rate we were going to pay our regular pianist." May's heart hammered in her chest. The amount Mrs. Byrne named was more than she made in 2 weeks at the restaurant. "I don't have a proper gown," she said. The first practical objection that came to mind, Mrs. Byrne waved a hand dismissively. "We can arrange something. The question is, can you still play at that level? Do you have the repertoire we need?" Could she? May thought of her daily practice sessions, of the pieces she still worked through in her mind, of the hours she spent teaching children to love the instrument she'd never stopped loving herself. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "I can play, but I would need access to a piano before the event, to practice on a proper instrument. The hotel has a Steinway in a private room. I'll make sure you have access starting today." Mrs. Byrne turned to Andre. "If you can spare her from her duties, that is." Andre nodded quickly, clearly pleased at this unexpected connection to the Byrne Foundation. "Of course. We'll adjust the schedule." And just like that, it was decided. The meeting moved on to discussing menu details and service logistics, but May barely heard any of it. She was going to play again. Publicly. For some of the same people who might have seen her perform years ago. Before life intervened, after the meeting, Rodrigo caught up with her as she mechanically wiped down tables. "You're not mad at me, right?" he asked, looking genuinely concerned. "I know I put you on the spot, but this is a big opportunity." May sighed. "I'm not mad, just scared. It's been a long time since I performed for people who really understand music." "You're at that piano in the community center every weekend," Rodrigo pointed out. "Those kids adore you. You've never stopped being a musician, May. You just stopped getting paid for it." There was truth in his words, but also a simplicity that didn't capture the complexity of her feelings. Walking away from her dream hadn't been a single decision but a series of small surrenders, day after day as reality demanded her attention more than ambition. "What if I'm not good enough anymore?" she whispered, voicing her deepest fear. Rodrigo squeezed her shoulder gently. "Then you'll still be a woman who had the courage to try. That's more than most people ever do." That afternoon, May found herself in a small practice room at the Grand Hotel, facing a gleaming Steinway grand piano worth more than she would earn in 10 years at the restaurant. Her fingers trembled slightly as she sat on the bench, adjusting its height. Feeling the cool ivory beneath her fingertips, she began with scales. Simple warm-ups that soon had her fingers remembering their old strength and flexibility. Then arpeggios, chord progressions, technical exercises she'd done thousands of times before. The piano responded beautifully, its action smooth and responsive, its tone rich and nuanced. Gradually, she moved into pieces, a Mozart sonata, a Chopin nocturne, a jazz standard she'd arranged herself years ago. The music flowed from her memory through her fingers, sometimes perfectly, sometimes with small mistakes that made her wince and repeat passages. She was rusty, yes, but underneath the rust was something solid and true that had never left her. As the hours passed, May felt herself reconnecting with a part of herself she'd kept carefully protected, afraid to want something she couldn't have. By the time she finished practicing, darkness had fallen outside the windows. Her back ached from sitting upright for so long. Her fingers were sore in a way they hadn't been in years, but her mind felt clearer than it had in months. She had 1 week to prepare, 1 week to remember not just how to play but how to perform, 1 week to decide if this was just a one-time return to her old life, or the beginning of something new. As she gathered her things to leave, her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. How did it feel to come home? May smiled, tears pricking her eyes as she typed back, "Like I never left." The week passed in a blur of work shifts and practice sessions. May's fingers developed calluses that had softened over the years, and muscles she had forgotten about began to ache pleasantly. Each day she spent 3 hours at the Steinway in the Grand Hotel, working through her planned program, making adjustments, building her stamina. Her mother had dug out May's old performance notebook, a small leather journal filled with program notes, performance reflections and technical reminders. Reading through it was like opening a time capsule, finding pieces of herself she had tucked away. "You wrote this after your first big recital," her mother said, pointing to an entry from 8 years ago. "You were so nervous you threw up backstage," May laughed, remembering. "And then I walked out and played perfectly. I was more afraid of disappointing my teacher than I was of the audience." Her mother's eyes grew serious. "Are you nervous about next week?" "Terrified," May admitted. but in a good way. I'd forgotten how it feels to have something at stake when I play. Teaching the kids is rewarding, but it's not the same as performing. The night before the event, May couldn't sleep. She lay awake, mentally rehearsing each piece, visualizing her hands on the keys, hearing the music in her mind. Around 3 in the morning, she gave up and went to the kitchen to make tea. To her surprise, her mother was already there, sewing by the dim light above the stove. "What are you doing up?" May asked. Her mother held up a simple black dress that May recognized from her college recitals. "Making adjustments. You've lost weight since you last wore this." May touched the fabric gently. "You kept it all this time?" "I kept everything," her mother said simply. "I always believed you would play again someday." Tears welled in May's eyes. "I'm sorry I gave it up." Her mother shook her head firmly. "You didn't give up anything. You made a choice. There's no shame in choosing family." "But your dream—" "My dream was for you to use your gifts, not how or where you use them," her mother interrupted. "Those children you teach, they hear your music too. Different stage, same gift." May hugged her mother tightly, inhaling the familiar scent of jasmine that always clung to her clothes. "Thank you for believing in me when I stopped believing in myself." "That's what mothers do," she replied, patting May's back. "Now try on this dress so I can finish the alterations." The day of the Burn Foundation event arrived with surprising speed. May had the morning off from the restaurant but was expected to arrive at the Grand Hotel by 4 o'clock for final preparations. The gala itself would begin at 6 with cocktails, dinner at 7, with her playing throughout both. May spent the morning going through her usual pre-performance routine, stretching exercises for her hands and wrists, mental run-throughs of difficult passages, and a light meal that wouldn't sit heavily in her stomach. Her mother helped her pin up her hair in an elegant twist, securing it with her grandmother's antique hairpins. "For luck," her mother said, stepping back to admire her work. "You look beautiful." The black dress fit perfectly after her mother's alterations, simple but elegant with its high neckline and 3/4 sleeves. May had polished her only pair of good shoes, and Mrs. Byrne had arranged for her to borrow a subtle pearl necklace from the hotel's jewelry boutique. When May arrived at the Grand Hotel, she was directed not to the service entrance as she had expected, but through the main lobby to the ballroom where the event would be held. The space was magnificent. High ceilings with crystal chandeliers, walls lined with gilded mirrors, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Hotel staff bustled about arranging flowers, setting tables with fine china and crystal, and adjusting lighting. The Steinway had been moved from the practice room to a small raised platform at one end of the ballroom. May walked toward it slowly, feeling oddly like she was approaching an old friend. This would not be like playing in the community center on an upright with sticky keys, nor like the digital keyboard she sometimes used for teaching. This was a concert instrument, designed to project into large spaces to communicate every nuance of touch and intention. "There you are," Mrs. Byrne said, appearing at May's side. "Everything is on schedule. You'll begin with cocktail music at 6, then transition to dinner music around 7:30. Feel free to mix classical and jazz as you see fit, though I've put a few requests from our major donors on this list." She handed May a small card with several piece names written in elegant script. May scanned the list, relieved to see she knew all the requested pieces. "I can do these, no problem." "Excellent. The staff will bring you water as needed. If you require a short break, just signal to me and I'll make an announcement." Mrs. Byrne started to walk away, then paused, turning back. "I'm very pleased you're here, May. When you disappeared from the competition circuit, many of us wondered what had happened. Talent like yours is rare." Before May could respond, Mrs. Byrne was called away by a frantic-looking event coordinator. May was left alone with the piano, using the quiet time before guests arrived to familiarize herself with the instrument's placement and acoustics. She played a few experimental chords, feeling how the sound resonated in the large space. The action was slightly heavier than the practice piano, requiring more finger strength, but the tone was richer, more complex. She made mental adjustments, planning how she would need to modify her touch for different pieces. Rodrigo appeared, dressed in his waiter's uniform but looking unusually formal. "Chef sent me to check if you need anything before we get swamped." May shook her head. "I'm okay. Nervous but ready. Half the kitchen staff is planning to sneak in during their breaks to hear you play," he confided with a grin. "We've got a betting pool on how many encores you'll get." "Encores?" May laughed. "I'm just background music, Rodrigo. No one's even going to be listening that closely. He gave her a knowing look. We'll see about that. As 6 o'clock approached, guests began to arrive. Women in elegant evening gowns and men in tuxedos, moving through the space with the easy confidence of wealth and privilege. May recognized some faces from the restaurant, including Mrs. Henderson, who gave her an encouraging smile and a discreet thumbs up. At precisely 6, Mrs. Byrne caught May's eye and nodded. It was time. May settled herself at the piano, adjusted the bench, and took a deep breath. For a moment, she was paralyzed with doubt. What was she doing here? Pretending to belong in this world she had left behind. These people had heard the best pianists in the world. What could she possibly offer them? Then she remembered her mother's words. Different stage. Same gift. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. She started with something safe, a Debussy piece that floated like clouds over the cocktail chatter. Her fingers remembered the way, finding the notes with increasing confidence as she relaxed into the music. She transitioned smoothly into a jazz standard, adding subtle improvisations that made the familiar tune her own. At first, no one seemed to notice. Conversations continued, drinks were served, people moved about the room networking and socializing. But gradually, May became aware of a shift. A couple standing near the piano had stopped talking to listen. An older gentleman had taken a seat in a nearby chair, his eyes closed in appreciation. Mrs. Henderson had positioned herself against a column, champagne glass in hand, openly watching May's performance. Encouraged, May moved into more complex territory, a Chopin nocturne that required both technical precision and emotional depth. Her body swayed slightly with the music, no longer playing safe but allowing herself to be transported by the piece as she once had been. When she finished the nocturne, something unexpected happened. Applause broke out. Not polite background clapping, but genuine, enthusiastic appreciation. May looked up, surprised to find that a small crowd had gathered around the piano. More shocking still was the silence that had fallen over other parts of the room. Conversations paused as people turned to see what was happening. Mrs. Byrne appeared at her side, beaming. "I think we might need to adjust our program slightly," she whispered. "They want to hear you, really hear you." May's heart raced with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. This wasn't what she had prepared for. Being background music was one thing, being the center of attention quite another. "What should I play?" She whispered back. "Whatever you love most," Mrs. Byrne replied. "That's always the best choice." May nodded, took another deep breath, and turned back to the piano. The crowd around her had grown, people drawn by the applause and the palpable shift in the room's energy. She caught Rodrigo's eye as he passed with a tray of champagne. He winked at her. She began Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, a piece that had always challenged her, that demanded everything she had to give. Her small hands stretched to reach the complex chords, finding the workarounds she had practiced for years. The piece built from its brooding opening to its thunderous climax. May's body now fully engaged in producing the sound, leaning into the keys, channeling all her pent-up emotion into the music. When the final chord resonated through the ballroom, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the room erupted in applause. May looked up, dazed, to see that nearly everyone had stopped what they were doing to listen. People were standing, some looking shocked, others delighted. Mrs. Henderson was openly wiping tears from her eyes. Mrs. Byrne stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we promised you exceptional music tonight, and I believe we have delivered. Please welcome May Lin, who has graciously stepped in for our usual pianist." The applause grew louder. May stood and gave a small, awkward bow, overwhelmed by the response. As she sat back down to continue playing, she realized that something fundamental had changed. She was no longer providing background music for a charity event. She was giving a concert. Dinner was delayed by 15 minutes as guests lingered around the piano, reluctant to move to their tables. Mrs. Byrne finally had to make a gentle announcement, reminding everyone that they would continue to enjoy May's playing throughout the meal. "We'll have plenty of music throughout the evening," she assured the crowd. "And perhaps if we're very fortunate, Ms. Lin might consider playing something special for us after dessert." May's cheeks flushed at the suggestion. She prepared for an actual performance piece, something meant to be listened to without the distraction of eating or conversation. But the energy in the room was so positive, so appreciative, that she found herself nodding in agreement. As guests moved to their assigned tables, May transitioned to softer dinner music, elegant but unobtrusive pieces that would allow conversation while still providing a pleasant backdrop. Her confidence had grown significantly after the unexpected response to her playing, and she found herself relaxing into a rhythm, enjoying the feel of the magnificent instrument beneath her fingers. From her position at the piano, she could see the entire ballroom. Waitstaff from Le Ciel moved efficiently between tables serving the first course. Rodrigo caught her eye and mouthed, "Told you so," as he passed by with a tray of appetizers. The guests, initially distracted by the food and their table companions, gradually returned their attention to the music during lulls in conversation. During a brief pause between pieces, a hotel staff member appeared at May's side with a glass of water and a small plate of food. "Mrs. Byrne thought you might be hungry," the young man explained. "She said to eat when you can. They're still on the first course, so you have time." Grateful for the thoughtfulness, May took a few quick bites and sips of water before returning to the piano. As she played, she noticed Mrs. Byrne moving from table to table, speaking briefly with various guests. Several times she saw people at the tables looking in her direction after these conversations, expressions of surprise or interest on their faces. The meal progressed and May continued playing, mixing classical pieces with jazz standards and even a few contemporary songs arranged in a classical style. She was in a state of flow now, that magical place where technical concerns fell away and only the music remained. Her body knew what to do without conscious direction, leaving her mind free to interpret, to feel, to communicate through sound. Between the main course and dessert, Mrs. Byrne approached the piano again, this time with an older gentleman in tow. He was tall and distinguished-looking, with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "May, I'd like you to meet Professor Harrington," Mrs. Byrne said. "He's the dean of the music department at the university, and one of our most generous supporters." May stood and extended her hand, suddenly conscious of her waitress calluses against his smooth, academic palm. "Your playing is extraordinary," Professor Harrington said, studying her face with curiosity. "Cynthia tells me you studied at Eastman but didn't complete your degree?" "Yes, sir," May replied. "Family circumstances." He nodded thoughtfully. "Yet you've clearly continued to develop as a musician. Your interpretation of the Rachmaninoff was unconventional but deeply effective. Where have you been performing?" May hesitated, glancing at Mrs. Byrne, who gave a small nod of encouragement. "I haven't been, really. I teach piano to children on weekends, and I work at Le Ciel restaurant. I'm one of the waitstaff here tonight, actually. Or I was supposed to be until this opportunity came up." Professor Harrington's eyebrows rose slightly, but he showed no other sign of surprise. "Fascinating. And where do you practice? Surely not on a restaurant piano. My neighbor lets me use her upright sometimes, and there's a piano at the community center where I teach." May felt a flush of embarrassment. "I know it's not ideal." "No, it's remarkable," he corrected her. "To maintain this level of artistry without proper resources speaks to an extraordinary commitment." Mrs. Byrne touched his arm gently. "We should let May continue her program, Richard. Perhaps you could finish this conversation later." He nodded. "Of course, but Miss Lynn, if you would be willing, I'd very much like to discuss some possibilities with you after the event." As they walked away, May felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride at the recognition from someone who clearly understood music at a high level, anxiety about what possibilities might mean, and an unexpected pang of regret for the academic path she had abandoned. She returned to the piano as dessert was being served, choosing to play Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat major, one of her favorite pieces. Its gentle beginning belied the technical challenges that came later, with cascading notes that required both precision and a light touch. As she played, she was transported back to her days at the conservatory, to practice rooms where she had spent countless hours perfecting this very piece. By the time coffee was served, a hush had fallen over the room again. People had stopped eating to listen, forks suspended in midair, conversations trailing off into silence. May could feel the attention of the room focused on her, but rather than making her nervous, it energized her. This connection between performer and audience was what she had missed most without realizing it. the invisible thread of communication that made music more than just organized sound. As she finished the Schubert, Mrs. Byrne approached the center of the room, champagne glass in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we conclude our meal portion of the evening, I have a special request. Our extraordinary pianist, Mei Lin, has agreed to play one final piece for us, not as background for our conversations, but as the focus of our attention. I ask that you join me in giving her your complete appreciation for what has already been a remarkable musical gift to our event." Applause broke out as May stood and gave a small bow. Her heart was racing, but not from fear, from exhilaration. This moment, unexpected as it was, felt right. It felt like coming home. She sat down again, took a deep breath, and began to play Liszt's Un Sospiro, one of the most challenging pieces in her repertoire. The etude required the melody to be played alternately by both hands while executing rapid arpeggios and crossing hands. It was a piece that showcased not just technical ability, but musicality and emotion. The room disappeared as May gave herself completely to the music. Her small hands moved with astonishing speed and precision across the keyboard, finding impossible reaches through the technical solutions she had developed over years of practice. The melody soared above the accompaniment, telling a story of longing and hope that reflected her own journey. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the room erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, some calling bravo. May stood overwhelmed by the response and bowed deeply. As the applause continued, she caught sight of an unexpected figure at the back of the room. Her mother, standing near the service entrance, tears streaming down her face. May hadn't known she was coming. One of the kitchen staff, probably Rodrigo, must have called her. Mrs. Byrne approached the piano again, this time with a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can all agree we've witnessed something special tonight. As you know, the mission of the Byrne Foundation is to support music education and to discover and nurture exceptional talent. I believe we've done exactly that tonight, albeit quite by accident." She turned to May. "Ms. Lin, would you mind telling our guests a little about yourself? How you came to be playing for us tonight?" May froze momentarily, not having prepared to speak. But as she looked out at the sea of interested faces, she found her voice. "I've loved music all my life," she began simply. "I was fortunate to study at Eastman Conservatory, but had to leave during my 3rd year when my mother became ill." She found her mother's eyes in the crowd and smiled. "I've been working at Le Ciel restaurant for the past 3 years. When your regular pianist couldn't perform, my colleague Rodrigo suggested me as a replacement." A murmur went through the crowd at this revelation. "I haven't performed publicly in a very long time," May continued, "so thank you for your kindness tonight. It's meant more than I can say." Mrs. Byrne took the microphone again. "What Ms. Lin hasn't told you is that before her studies were interrupted, she was considered one of the most promising young pianists of her generation. I had the privilege of hearing her play in the Young Artists competition several years ago, where her performance left many of us in tears." She turned to address the room more broadly. "Ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of tonight's event is to raise funds for music education in underprivileged communities. We believe that talent exists everywhere, but opportunity does not. Ms. Lin's story is a powerful reminder of how circumstances can interrupt even the most promising careers." Mrs. Byrne reached into her evening bag and pulled out a checkbook. "I had planned to make my usual donation tonight, but after this performance I'm doubling it. And I'm specifically requesting that part of these funds be used to establish a scholarship for musicians who have had to interrupt their education due to family circumstances." She turned to May again. "With Ms. Lin's permission, we'll call it the May Lin Second Chance Scholarship." Tears sprang to May's eyes as the crowd broke into applause again. She nodded, unable to speak. As the formal program concluded and guests began to mingle again, people approached the piano one by one to thank May and ask questions about her background. Business cards were pressed into her hand, from music teachers offering studio time, from wealthy patrons offering sponsorship, from event planners seeking to book her for future performances. It was overwhelming, this sudden shift in how the world saw her. Just hours ago, she had been a waitress preparing to provide background music. Now, she stood at the center of a whirlwind of possibilities she had long ago stopped allowing herself to imagine. After most guests had departed, May sat alone at the piano, gently running her fingers over the keys without pressing them. The ballroom was nearly empty now, with hotel staff quietly clearing tables and breaking down decorations. Her mind was still trying to process everything that had happened, the whirlwind of the evening and its unexpected turns. "There you are," her mother said, approaching with 2 cups of tea she had somehow procured from the kitchen. "I thought you might need this." May accepted the cup gratefully. "How did you know to come tonight?" "Your friend from the restaurant called me. He said I shouldn't miss it." Her mother sat beside her on the piano bench. He was right. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping tea and watching the efficient dismantling of the elegant event. "Are you happy?" her mother finally asked. May considered the question carefully. "I think I'm stunned. It doesn't feel real yet. You played beautifully. Like before, but different too. More depth," May nodded. "That's how it felt. Like all these years of living, of struggling, of teaching, they've changed how I understand the music." Her mother squeezed her hand. "That's why great artists don't just need technique. They need life." Professor Harrington approached them, looking slightly hesitant to interrupt their moment. "Excuse me, I hope I'm not intruding." May introduced him to her mother, who bowed slightly in greeting. "I wanted to discuss something with you before you left," he said, pulling up a chair to sit across from them. "Our department has a visiting artist program. We bring in professionals to work with our students, give master classes, and occasionally perform. After hearing you tonight, I'd like to offer you a position for next semester." May blinked in surprise. "But I don't have a completed degree." "I'm not a professional," the professor smiled. "I'd argue that your performance tonight says otherwise. Besides, our students could learn a great deal from someone who has maintained such artistry while balancing other responsibilities. It's not full-time, 3 days a week with flexibility in scheduling. The pay?" her mother asked practically. He named a figure that made both women's eyes widen. "That's very generous," May said cautiously. "It's market rate for someone of your talent," he replied, "and it includes access to our practice rooms and performance spaces. We have 7 Steinways on campus." May's heart leapt at the thought of regular access to proper pianos again. "I would still need to keep my job at the restaurant, at least part-time. As I said, the schedule is flexible, and this could potentially lead to other opportunities." He handed her his card. "Think about it. Call me on Monday with your decision." After he left, May and her mother looked at each other in disbelief. "Did that really just happen?" May whispered. Her mother nodded, tears in her eyes. "Life takes unexpected turns. Sometimes they lead back to where you were meant to be all along." Mrs. Byrne found them as they were preparing to leave. "May, I'm so glad I caught you. First, I want to give you this." She handed her an envelope. "Your payment for tonight plus a little extra. You transformed our event." May tried to protest the extra, but Mrs. Byrne waved her objections away. "Second, I've spoken with several of our foundation board members. We're serious about the scholarship we mentioned. Would you be willing to meet next week to discuss the details? We'd like your input on the criteria since it will bear your name." "I'd be honored," May said, still struggling to believe this was really happening. "Excellent. And finally, our regular pianist, Mr. Abernathy, is taking a medical leave for at least 6 months. We host monthly events plus special fundraisers. We'd like to offer you a contract to be our regular performer during his absence." May's mind raced, trying to calculate how she could manage this along with the university position, her restaurant job, and her teaching at the community center. As if reading her thoughts, Mrs. Byrne added, "We understand you may have other commitments. The contract would be per event, allowing you to accept or decline based on your availability. And the fee is quite substantial." The figure she named was more than May earned in 2 weeks at the restaurant. "I'll need to look at my schedule," May said carefully, "but I'm definitely interested." "Wonderful. I'll have my assistant send over the details tomorrow." Mrs. Byrne paused, her expression softening. "You know, in all my years with the foundation, I've rarely seen an audience respond the way they did tonight. You have a gift, May. I'm glad the world is getting another chance to hear it." The night air was cool as May and her mother waited for their rideshare outside the hotel. The city lights sparkled around them, cars rushed by, and late-night pedestrians hurried past. It was the same city it had been that morning, but somehow everything felt different. "I should call Rodrigo and thank him," May said, suddenly remembering her friend's role in the evening's events. "Tomorrow," her mother advised. "Tonight is for processing." When they arrived home, May expected to feel exhaustion crash over her. Instead, she felt strangely energized. While her mother prepared for bed, she sat at their small kitchen table and began making lists of potential pieces for future performances, of questions for Professor Harrington about the university position, of things she would need if she were to start performing regularly again. It was after midnight when she finally crawled into bed beside her mother, who was sleeping peacefully. But as she lay in the darkness, May couldn't stop her mind from racing through the events of the day, replaying moments, conversations, and most of all, the feeling of performing again, really performing, with an audience that was truly listening. 3 months later, May sat in the green room of the university recital hall, taking deep breaths to calm her nerves. Through the door, she could hear the murmur of the audience gathering for her first formal concert in nearly 4 years. So much had changed in such a short time. She now worked at Le Ciel only 1 night a week, partly for the income, but mostly because she couldn't bear to completely leave the place and people who had supported her through difficult years. The rest of her time was divided between teaching at the university, performing at Byrne Foundation events, and giving private lessons to a small but growing group of students. Her mother had been able to reduce her work hours at the library, easing the strain of her recovery. They had moved to a slightly larger apartment, one with enough space for the digital piano that May had purchased with her first Byrne Foundation payment. There was a soft knock on the door, and Rodrigo peeked in. "Backstage access," he said with a grin, holding up the pass that hung around his neck. "Being friends with the star has its perks," May laughed. "Hardly a star. Just a very lucky waitress. Former waitress," he corrected, stepping into the room. "Though Andre says your job is still there if you ever want it back. Might take him up on that if tonight's a disaster." "It won't be." Rodrigo's usual joking manner was replaced with sincere confidence. "I brought you something." He handed her a small box. Inside was a delicate bracelet with a single charm, a tiny silver piano. "From all of us at Le Ciel," he explained, a little reminder of where this journey restarted. May's eyes filled with tears as she fastened it around her wrist. "Thank you. I never would have had the courage without you putting me on the spot that day. You always had the courage. You just needed the push." He checked his watch. "I should get to my seat. Half the restaurant staff is out there, by the way. We've got a whole section." After he left, May's mother entered carrying a small bouquet of flowers. "These just arrived for you," she said, reading from the card. "To second chances and new beginnings. Catherine Byrne." May added the flowers to several other arrangements that had been delivered throughout the day, from Professor Harrington, from her students at the community center, from Mrs. Henderson and other regular customers at Le Ciel who had followed her journey. "Nervous?" her mother asked, straightening May's concert dress, a new one purchased specially for this occasion. "Terrified," May admitted. "But in a good way." Her mother nodded in understanding. "I brought something else for you." She reached into her purse and pulled out a faded photograph. It showed a tiny May, no more than 5 years old, sitting at a battered upright piano in their old apartment back in Taiwan. Her feet didn't reach the pedals and her small hands were stretched across the keys, but her expression was one of pure joy. "Your first lesson," her mother explained. "Before competitions, before scholarships, before dreams of concert halls. Just you and the music." May studied the photo, remembering that simple joy, the pure pleasure of making sounds that moved her heart. "That's still why I play," she realized aloud. "Not for applause or recognition. For that feeling," her mother smiled. "Then you have already succeeded no matter what happens tonight." A stagehand knocked on the door. "5 minutes, Ms. Lin." May took one last look in the mirror, straightening her shoulders and lifting her chin. The face that looked back at her was both familiar and new, still the same May who had served plates at Le Ciel, but also someone who had reclaimed a part of herself she thought was lost forever. As she walked toward the stage, she could hear the audience quieting in anticipation. Among them were people from every part of her journey. Her former restaurant colleagues, her university students, Byrne Foundation patrons, her community center kids and their parents. And in the front row, her mother who had never stopped believing. The stage lights were bright as May stepped out, momentarily blinding her. She bowed to warm applause, then moved to the piano. A magnificent Steinway concert grand. As she settled on the bench and placed her hands on the keys, a profound sense of rightness washed over her. Life rarely follows a straight path. Sometimes it takes unexpected detours, painful pauses, and seeming dead ends. But as May began to play the opening notes of her concert, she understood that every step of her journey, even the difficult ones, had brought her exactly where she needed to be. The music rose from her fingers, filling the hall with a story only she could tell, one of loss and perseverance, of obligations and dreams, of the courage to begin again. And in that moment, she was neither waitress nor pianist, neither teacher nor student. She was simply May, making music for the pure joy of it, as she had always been meant to do.